Hoppe off this nonsense. Why argumentation isn't a libertarian confession. Abstract. Hans Hermann Hoppe's argumentation ethics attempts to derive libertarian principles from the very act of making an argument. This paper dismantles that claim by demonstrating that argumentation does not logically commit the speaker to self-ownership, non-aggression, or any other libertarian axiom. We show that there exist an infinite number of ethical frameworks that are fully consistent with engaging in argumentation, provided that the act itself does not violate the speaker's ethical system at that moment. Two illustrative counterexamples, one grounded in utilitarianism and the other in a comically conditional ethics framework, expose the core error of AE. Mistaking the use of a tool for a declaration of universal moral truth. The argument collapses not from complexity, but from the childish simplicity of its central fallacy. That major figures in the Austrian school, Rothbard, Kinsella, Bloch, and Woods, have endorsed it only underscores their inability to handle rigorous logical analysis. 1. Introduction. Hans Hermann Hoppe's argumentation ethics has been presented as a silver bullet for libertarianism. An apodictic proof that anyone who engages in argumentation must necessarily accept libertarian norms, particularly self-ownership and the non-aggression principle. The supposed brilliance of the argument lies in its self-reinforcing nature. Argue against libertarianism, and you've already conceded it by using peaceful discourse. But this seductive neatness falls apart under even minimal scrutiny. AE assumes that the act of argumentation is a moral confession, an implicit endorsement of peaceful interaction and voluntary engagement. It then retrofits libertarian axioms onto this act, claiming that argumentation presupposes them. This paper takes the roundabout route to demolition. We won't nitpick obscure premises or debate semantic minutiae. Instead, we'll show, through straightforward logic and accessible examples, that argumentation is perfectly consistent with ethical systems that reject libertarianism. So long as those systems do not themselves prohibit argumentation in that moment. The only thing AE proves is that Hoppe mistook strategic behavior for moral commitment. 2. The general case, ethics compatible with argumentation. The central flaw in Hoppe's argumentation ethics is that it treats argumentation as a moral confession, as if merely engaging in discussion commits you to a very specific set of ethical principles, namely libertarian ones. But this is simply false. The reality is much simpler and much more damning to Hoppe's framework. You can construct an infinite number of ethical systems that are perfectly consistent with making an argument, so long as the act of argumentation isn't forbidden by that system at that moment. That's it. That's the only requirement. If someone argues, they are not proving that they believe in non-aggression, or self-ownership, or peaceful engagement as a universal norm. They're only showing that, under their own ethical rules, right now, they are permitted to argue. This includes utilitarian ethics, conditional ethics, strategic ethics, arbitrary ethics, even incoherent ethics. Each of these systems allows for argumentation under some circumstances. And since the conditions can be infinitely varied, by time, identity, situation, randomness, or ritual, the number of compatible systems is infinite. Hoppe's logic assumes that the reason for arguing must be universal and peaceful. But in reality, people argue because they find it effective for their own goals, not because it commits them to a shared moral foundation. If your ethical system allows you to argue at that moment, and there's no contradiction in doing so, then there's no performative contradiction. 3. Example 1, Utilitarian Instrumentalism. Let's begin with a clean utilitarian example. A utilitarian argues, we should maximize utility. In this case, I believe making an argument will persuade others and lead to better outcomes. To Hoppe, this peaceful act is a confession of libertarian virtue. You chose not to aggress. That means you accept non-aggression as a norm. But the utilitarian replies, no, I didn't aggress because I thought arguing would work better this time. If violence had a higher utility, I'd do that instead. There is no contradiction. The act of argumentation is contingent, not sacred. The utilitarian is fully consistent within their framework. Argumentation is just a means to an end, used when it is expected to produce more utility than alternatives, including violence. As long as the utilitarian believes that arguing in this context leads to the best outcome, there is no inconsistency. To show a contradiction, one would have to demonstrate that the utilitarian believes violence would be more effective in this moment, yet chooses not to use it. Or that they hold argumentation to be harmful while still engaging in it. But no such inconsistency exists in ordinary utilitarian reasoning. Hoppe's accusation of a performative contradiction dissolves the moment you understand that the act of arguing, for a utilitarian, is entirely instrumental. Hoppe's error here is akin to saying, if you walk on a sidewalk, you must be endorsing government-built infrastructure. But that's obviously wrong. Using something in a given moment doesn't imply a belief or endorsement, it just means you found it convenient, useful, or less costly than the alternatives. For example 2, the Monday exception. Now for a hilariously simple case. Suppose I say, aggression is always justified, except on Mondays. It's Monday. I calmly make this argument. According to AE, I've self-destructed. By choosing to argue, I've affirmed peaceful, voluntary interaction, which must mean I believe in the non-aggression principle. But I reply, actually, I said aggression is wrong on Mondays. It's Monday. I'm peaceful today. I'm acting entirely within my ethical rules. There's no contradiction here. My ethic is conditional. I argue when my rule permits it. Tomorrow, I might choose violence, and that, too, would be consistent with my rule. AE fails to account for this. It cannot handle conditional norms. It collapses the moment you move beyond always versus never ethics and introduce even the slightest nuance. 5. What argumentation actually rules out? Argumentation logically contradicts any ethical system that explicitly prohibits the use of reasoned discourse in the context in which it is being employed. This includes, but is not limited to, ethical systems that require constant aggression, systems that forbid communication or persuasion altogether, frameworks that deny the legitimacy or possibility of argumentation, norms that condemn the use of reason or dialogue in that specific moment. This is not an exhaustive list. Other contradictions may arise depending on how a given ethical system applies to the specific context of the argument. Argumentation may also rule out other ethical systems depending on the nature of the context and internal consistency of the system itself. When you make an argument, the only thing you are admitting is that you are not currently operating under an ethic that prohibits argumentation. You have not endorsed non-aggression. You have not affirmed libertarianism. You have not accepted self-ownership. You've simply shown that your moral system, right now, allows you to speak. This still leaves room for strategic violence, conditional aggression, hypocrisy, utilitarian calculation, aggression every day except Monday. And AE can't handle any of it. 6. Argumentation is a medium, not a meta-ethic. The core confusion in AE is the assumption that argumentation reflects an ethical belief. But using a method doesn't imply endorsing a moral system, it implies a local choice of tool. Consider. I use public roads. That doesn't mean I believe in taxation. I wear clothes. That doesn't mean I believe in modesty laws. I speak English. That doesn't mean I think English is morally superior. I argue. That doesn't mean I believe in the non-aggression principle. AE confuses behavioral compatibility with normative implication. It tries to extract morality from tactics. 7. Epilogue, the Austrian school of non-existent contradictions. That argumentation ethics is still repeated by otherwise intelligent-sounding libertarians is a testament not to its validity, but to the ideological desperation of the Austrian school's priesthood. Rothbard hailed it as the final, irrefutable proof of libertarianism. Stefan Kinsella cites it like divine revelation. Walter Block defends it like a medieval scholastic. Tom Woods preaches it in podcast sermons like Hoppe descended from the mount with stone tablets. But none of these men ever asked the most basic logical question. Does using an argument imply a belief in the ethics that permit it? Of course not. And the fact that they never questioned it, yet built entire books, careers, and Twitter threads around it, reveals a deep allergy to intellectual rigor. You cannot take seriously the ethical reasoning of people who believe that moving your mouth is an involuntary pledge of eternal pacifism. Conclusion. Hans Hermann Hoppe's argumentation ethics is not an ethical theory. It is a bait-and-switch. It conflates tactical speech with moral confession, and it weaponizes this confusion to trap opponents in artificial contradictions. But as we've shown, there are infinitely many ethical systems, most of them more flexible, more evolved, and more consistent, that allow for argumentation without binding you to libertarian dogma. The only thing your argument proves is that you're not presently acting under a rule that forbids arguing. Everything else? Hoppe fantasy. Argumentation ethics is not a deduction. It is a delusion. Hoppe off this nonsense.